everyone. My name is Penny Wright. I'm in charge of adult programs here at the Rogers Memorial Library, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight to learn a little bit about what it was like to work at the Southampton Press in the 1950s and actually the early 1960s, and also to be in this community during those years. We thank Richard Behrens, the director of the Southampton Historical Museum, who is here with us tonight, for co-sponsoring these oral history evenings with us. Hillary Woodward, who is the president of the board of the Historical Museum, is also on our program staff, and we thank her for her work tonight, putting together this great display that you see in back of our guests, and we hope you'll browse a little bit after this evening is over. Some of our panelists brought in memorabilia, which we'll show you during this hour, and you can have a look at later as well. Actually, Peter Robinson made a wonderful family tree, sort of a timeline, for this Burling family, which is a family with deep roots, and a lot of people in it, including John Holden, who's here in the audience, and maybe there are others of you who are related to the Burling family. I know you're related to some of the panelists here, so we have a lot of Burling-related people here tonight. We're grateful to Joe Lockheim, who is the current publisher of the press, for mentioning our program in a couple of large ads in the Southampton Press last week. And we're also grateful to Portia Flanagan, who couldn't be here tonight, but who came to one of our meetings and gave us some good ideas of stories that we can tell you. Southampton in the 1950s was essentially a sleepy farming community with a summer season that stretched from July 4th to Labor Day, precisely, and a summer population of wealthy residents who came east from New York City or north from Palm Beach, Florida, and shopped at Lilly Pulitzer, Elizabeth Arden, Peck and Peck, Folk and Folk, Saks, and I'm sure some other stores that you all can remember and I might not be able to. Village landmarks included Town Hall, where Saks is now located, Corwitz, Margaret's Rendezvous, Anne's Luncheonette, the rival to Margaret's, the Style Shop, Bob Keene's bookstore on Main Street, which was also an art gallery, and the Hampton Manor, which was located where the IGA is now and which was moved, I think partly destroyed and partly moved, to make way for the wonderful IGA, and actually to make room for what was then Bohax. There was no Sip and Soda until 1958. There was Clyde and Stan's Act 4. Remember that? On Joe's Lane. And televisions were just beginning to arrive on the scene, black and white TVs, that is. But most of us who grew up here in the 1950s spent our childhoods playing outside with our friends, and our mothers were at home. Operators greeted you with the words, "Number please," when you picked up the telephone. Your family doctor made house calls, and no one had air conditioners. But most of us do not remember the summers being that hot. Here with us tonight, we are very grateful to 4 longtime community members who agreed to come in and reminisce about the old days and the old ways at the Southampton Press. And I'd like to introduce them to you. To my left is Irene Street White. Irene White is the great-granddaughter of Walter Rogers Burling. Her father, the late Hurlbut Street, was the nephew of Frank Burling and the first cousin of Hazel Burling Brown, Peter's grandmother. And he was the editor and longtime manager and foreman at the Southampton Press until his death in 1962. Irene grew up in Southampton. She attended the Southampton schools and Portland University, and then returned to Southampton and married Merritt White, here in our audience tonight. They settled in Bridgehampton for 28 years. Irene worked for 7 summers at the Southampton Press as a printer's devil. That's what she called herself. And we'll find out why. She performed a wide variety of jobs, including running the small printing press, job printing, collating, wrapping, bundling, and delivering newspapers. Irene is the mother of 4 and has worked for many years in her husband's osteopathic practice. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Irene. Please welcome Irene. Seated next to Irene is Peter Burling Robinson, who is the great-great-grandson of Walter Rogers Burling, the founder of the Southampton Press and also of about a dozen newspapers in the New York and Long Island area. In a few moments, Peter will give you a little background about the Burling family. And after our program, you'll have a look at our timeline, if you'd like to. Peter's parents, Bill and Shirley Robinson, published the Southampton Press in the 1950s, and Peter spent a fair amount of time in his childhood and adolescence in the back shop learning the ropes from Burke Street, Irene's father, and generally making trouble. No, I should say that. No, that's not true. Peter attended Andover, Dartmouth College, and the University of California at San Diego before earning a law degree at the University of California at Santa Clara. He practiced law in San Francisco until 1984, when he returned to Southampton, and he has worked in building since he returned. Please welcome Peter Robinson. To Peter's left is our next guest, Helen Camp. Helen was born in Philadelphia in, I have to tell you the year, 1912, making her the senior member of this group by quite a few years. Helen grew up in Philadelphia and met her future husband, John, when his father was stationed at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. After graduation from high school, she worked for a pharmaceutical company, and she and John were married. They moved to Southampton in 1935 after the birth of their first son, John, to join John's father's upholstery business, and together they went on to produce one of the biggest families Southampton has seen in recent times. I can't speak for a century ago, but they had 10 children, 8 of whom survived. And Helen Camp is also the grandmother of 16 and the great-grandmother of 4, one of whom is in this audience. So we have 4 generations of Camps in this audience. So we welcome your whole family, including one who is asleep. She's the only one who's going to sleep through tonight. Helen Camp is the only one of tonight's guests who is still working at the Southampton Press. She has been working there for 44 years. And over the years, she has performed a wide variety of jobs, from circulation manager to collating and wrapping, delivering, doing office work, and much more. It is a great pleasure to have her with us tonight. Please welcome Helen Camp. Somebody always has to be last. And last but not least is certainly another very beloved member of the Southampton Press family for many years, and his name is Larry Finney. Larry was born in Sag Harbor but moved to Southampton and attended schools here, and began his career at the Southampton Press when Irene's father, Herb Street, was looking for a high school kid to come in on Saturdays and help out. This was not fancy work in the beginning. And Larry was the man for the job. After that, he began spending his summers working at the Southampton Press, and in 1953, when Dave Bishop, then the pressman, enlisted in the Navy during the Korean War, Larry took his place, putting the newspaper together for 21 years. Don Lockhart described him as a job printer par excellence in the wonderful 100th anniversary issue of the Southampton Press, which you can see a little bit later on. In 1974, Larry started his own business in Flanders, Eastern Suffolk Printing. He stayed in business there until 2001, when he left to become a salesman for Pine Barrens Printing. And we are sure that they should be feeling pretty lucky to have you work for them, Larry. Larry is married to Cornelia Finney, here in our audience, and he's the father of John Finney. We thank you, Larry, very, very much for being here tonight. Please welcome Larry. Okay, we have to get the background out of the way. So you've got to listen and concentrate on this, but we thought we would ask Peter Robinson to begin by just giving us a little bit of an overview of this Burling family. Could you do that for a couple minutes, Peter?
Sure. Well, later you can all peruse the family chart there that starts with Walter Rogers Burling, his wife Huldah Wells, who was from Aquabog. It's a little vignette of them there, and my family. And as you'll see, they had quite a few offspring and so forth and so on, many of whom are here today. There's also been recently published a 2-volume set of the Burling family history, which is over on the lectern there, which you're welcome to look at later. So that's in brief.
So there was Walter and his wife, and two of their
sons, Frank and
George,
founded the East Hampton Star and the Southampton Press. And
now Frank was your mom's grandfather, is that correct?
Right.
And George, Irene,
his brother George,
was her grandfather.
No, another brother was her grandfather.
Okay, sorry. So Frank's nephew was Irene's dad. That's correct, I think.
Right.
Their sister was Grace.
Sorry.
That's right.
And Grace was my dad's mom.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Now we got that. It's easier to look at the chart, even for us.
We're going to be watching to see how many of you look at this chart. Okay. Let's just begin by kind of setting the stage a little bit and talking just a little bit about Southampton in the 1950s. Let me just ask you all, what were your impressions of, some of your impressions of Southampton? For those of you who moved here more recently, let's tell you a few things about what this village was like then. How about starting with you, Irene?
I was born in 1942, actually, and we lived in the house my grandfather built on the corner of David White's Lane and Powell Avenue. And our house was surrounded by potato lots. There were really no houses in the woods except camps near the bays. Most of the houses, Edge of Woods Roads was kind of the end where the homes were built at that time. And
so it was a much more rural place.
Yes, it was. There was a farming industry definitely here.
So you grew up in a village. Actually, all of you lived in the village, didn't you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I was really
Way out of town. Oh.
Although I was born in Sag Harbor,
Right.
we came up, I moved here when I was about 2 years old, and I've been here ever since. And one of my memories of the Joe Lane era was when I started working at the press. The fact that you could park your car out there, leave your keys in the ignition, and 4:30 you go home, your car was there, you go home, no problem.
No problem. So
Never
winter
lock your house, even if you went away for the weekend.
Right, you never did.
Joe Lane in the summertime was full of big black Cadillacs and chauffeurs. Likewise, Main Street. Of course, you don't see that anymore. I guess that was what was
They can't
considered
find a
old
place to
money.
park.
Nobody does that anymore.
And Larry, this was before they built the parking lot in back of Main
Yes.
Street as well,
Right.
right? What were some of the stores on Job's Lane that you remember?
Well, there was Folk and Folk, Harry Shearer's, let's see.
Now, what was Harry Shore? You want to
That
tell?
was I think they came from Fort Worth or Lake Worth, somewhere in one of the, they had a shop in Florida. They would come up every summer. Likewise, Abercrombie and Fitch, down at the end of Joe's Lane was Gowan Service Station, which is obviously gone now. And Chef Miller's, places like that.
Fordham and Elliston must have been there, right?
Fordham and
Elliston?
Elliston,
And what about Herbert and Liz? Doesn't that business go back a while?
It does, it was
Could
there
ask
then.
Mary.
In the 40s, it
Urban
was.
and Bristol.
Oh, yeah. Herbert and Liz.
And next to the press actually was a Jennings Market. Unfortunately, the painting I just noticed fell down, but we can look at it later. There's a map you can come up and look at later of Job's Lane in the 60s. And it doesn't show Jennings Market, but there were a lot of markets in the village.
Oh, yeah. Right. What were
Starting
some
in
of
North
them?
McLaren's, Herbert's, Val's, where Ted's is now on Hampton Road. Well, Katina's was there in the old building, which burned down. Jennings Market.
That's right. Eureka.
What else?
The Herberts, Eureka?
Eureka. Schwank's Market, right? Where the F-type building.
Frederick's, that's
Gardner's, right? Mr. Gardner, remember well? His old
the
green
Anchorage.
delivery.
The Anchorage.
The Anchorage
Was
as a
there?
restaurant, yeah.
And they were all family businesses, really.
And they were all family businesses.
Except for the big clothing shops, they were all family businesses.
True.
Now, I don't know if we established that at that time the press was on Job's Lane. Did we say that? And Peter, where was it on Job's Lane?
It was basically across from the Parish Art Museum. There's a new storefront there with a big round arched entryway in the center, red brick. It was always red brick.
Yeah.
And that was mostly torn down for the new renovation that's there now. There was an alleyway going up the side to deliver the newsprint and take supplies in and out.
What was the address on Job's Lane?
22 Job's Lane.
And Peter, didn't you work on the new building that took its place?
Yeah, we built the arched entryway that's there with Michael, your brother-in-law.
Now, Nina Murray had a store.
Yes.
So was she your neighbor?
Well, she was down the street a little bit across, but she ended up moving into this new building.
She was a good person to be friendly with.
The Southampton Press was a long, narrow building, and we had an alleyway on the west side, and a nice big courtyard that was in back of all those shops. And of course, that's where the garbage went, the trash and everything. And one summer, when I was probably taking a break, I was out in the courtyard and I found a beautiful tuxedo shirt in a Chet Miller box. And of course, I was thrilled. I really couldn't use that, so I returned it, but I always remember that.
To the chef, to Chef Miller?
Yeah.
Maybe somebody
Didn't mean to throw
had
it out.
stolen it and then...
No, it
wanted-
was just thrown out in the trash.
Oh, they did. Did they give you a reward? I guess back then you didn't have to get a reward if you did something good. You were just supposed to be good.
What we did was save up our money so we could buy something maybe at Chet Miller's.
How about the people, other than the people who arrived from the summer, did you know most of the people you saw on the street?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. And most of the shop owners knew the people that came in. I mean, it was a very small town. It's hard to appreciate now. There were, if you go down Job's Lane and look carefully to the opposite side of the street, especially if you go down and from the north side and look, well, just look up at the roof lines, you'll see a lot of the roof lines of houses that were actually lived in by friends of my grandmother's. I remember going there with her and having tea on porches on the south side of Job's Lane, big old grand houses.
Corwitz, did we mention Corwitz? Did you all take coffee breaks ever and go to Corwitz or?
Corwitz Pharmacy and had a luncheonette side to it. It was right on the corner where Dansk Design is, near the library, the old library building. And
that was a wonderful place.
Yeah.
It was because they served, I mean, you could buy everything you needed, but they also had the best ice cream sodas and English muffins.
Orange sherbet.
Yeah. So we all have memories of Corwitz. But also Silver's, which is still there today, was a stationery store, or not really stationery, newspaper store, magazines, and candy bars. So that, we were talking about coffee breaks, but I would go take a nickel and go for a candy bar break and get a Mountain
Where
Bar
the
for
cheese
my
shop
dad.
is now.
Yeah.
Right, with
Where
Silver.
the cheese shop is today.
That was Holden's.
And there was Holden's.
Holden's, where Silver's is today.
Right, where Silver's is today.
Was a stationery and office supplies.
That's right. All right, so before we talk a little bit more about the technical work at the press, let's just take a few moments, if we can, and remember some of the employees who were there in the 50s. Can we sort of go through and sort of from the front to the back? We won't talk a great deal about what they all did, but let's just remember some of them for the record.
Well, certainly a couple of the editors, Pete Moore,
Pete Moore, yeah.
and before Portia Flanagan. Those are the two main I remember. And my grandmother, Hazel, and my mom, and my dad were there. That part of it, when I was young, was a real family operation. And as you went up the stairs, Mildred Wild was there doing bookkeeping. And then, well, at that point, that was it, right, in terms of the small operation.
Front office, yeah.
In terms of the back shop, Herb Street was the foreman, later Dave Bishop, Larry.
Line type operator was Chester Brownheath from East Hampton.
Yeah.
And Bill Ewell came up on Wednesday nights to help out. And
How about Carl Loomis?
he came along in the 60s.
He came along later.
Yeah, in the 60s.
And then we talked about the summer help, which was Peter, Irene, and your sister, did she work there for a while,
Little bit.
Leslie?
Yeah, proofreading, things like that.
Okay. Now, let's just briefly talk about just what each of you did at the press a little bit, starting with you, Irene.
Okay. My father actually was 57 years old when I began working there, so he had been working there most of his lifetime. And I was 13 years old, and I used to run around in there, bringing him lunch or picking him up at night. People only had one car also, so we would bring him to work. And he probably decided that I was old enough to help him out. And that's what I did. I came and started helping him out before I had working papers. And he was always a very conscientious, dedicated person. And he was always afraid an inspector might come. So I was always ready to run out into the courtyard and take weeds or whatever. So I helped him in every way that I could. And that's why I jokingly call myself a printer's devil. But I was really doing boys' work and I loved being out there with Larry and Dave and my father because they joked around and told stories, and it just was very pleasant. There was a huge skylight in the summer. It was airy because all the doors were open. There was no AC. It was an ideal job for me. It wasn't boring. I was running errands. I did learn to use a lot of machinery, like the big stapler machine. He taught me to run the press. Eventually, it was a little press with a clutch and everything, and he was very particular about the work I did there. And I wrapped packages, ran errands, folded, collated, all kinds of things to make his job a little easier in the summer, because summer was so busy there.
It must have been very nice for him to have his daughter there. And certainly since he died quite young, did he not? It must be gratifying for you to have actually had that time when most kids are really not spending a lot of time with their
Yeah, we really
father.
enjoyed that time.
That's great.
Then I continued working there after he died, and then got married, worked one more summer, and I never thought about going into the business, actually.
But then you had your work cut out for you because you have 4 kids.
Oh, yes, eventually.
Okay.
And when Irene got her driver's license, one of my main memories of her is of Irene driving my grandmother's 1960 Buick, which was the delivery vehicle for the press. And we'd pile I didn't have a license yet, because Irene's about 5 years older than me, so we'd pile all the papers in the back seat, and we'd just take off for the East. And I don't know what it was, but there was something about one day, I can picture it right now, driving into Bridgehampton to the candy kitchen, delivering probably 20 papers, and we went to the post offices. I can't remember if we went to East Hampton, but anyway, life was simple then. The whole road fit in the back seat of my grandmother's Buick, with a lot of room to spare. And then later I got my license and I worked as a summer delivery man for many years. And we graduated to a small Volkswagen van.
Was it a press vehicle, actually?
Yeah, it was
the
a
press?
commercial type vehicle. Yeah. Do you remember that one? Because it was small enough to back up the alleyway and get the papers in that way.
How about you, Mrs. Camp? Tell us some of the things. Now, I know that of all the people here, you might have had to go to work at the earliest hour. Is that correct?
Until in the morning I used to go.
Did you hear that?
On Thursday mornings mainly,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
2 in the morning. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I had a couple of frights, and I cut with the chief of the police. He said to me, "When you're ready to leave that house, Alan, you give us a call." So I always had a police escort.
You didn't have far to go.
And then they used to watch it. They used to take care of me all the time I was down there, because I was practically the only one in the office at the time.
Was the door even locked? You probably had a key.
Oh yeah, I had a key.
Yeah.
Now, what did you do when you got in there at 2 o'clock in the morning?
Well, yeah, I had to, we had to get every paper down at that time was wrapped. So I had to make sure that
Every individual paper?
every individual paper was wrapped.
Wow, what did they wrap it in?
Well, with the paper, that's when we make the labels. And then I used to run the papers for the kids.
Now, do you mean that the whole paper was wrapped in like brown paper or something? Or just
No,
covered over with
invisible.
the label?
The mailers.
The mailers? Okay, gotcha.
Out of town.
Okay, I see.
With the name stamped on the
I see.
wrapper.
The name was taped on them.
And at that time, about how many people subscribed to the press, would you imagine?
1,000 or so,
Well, we
roughly.
had the 3 papers in them. We had the press,
That's right.
Hampton Bays News, and the Chronicle.
Which were all
separate.
printed on that site.
Yeah.
When you went to work at 2 o'clock in the morning, did you get off early?
No,
Did they make you work till 5? No.
When would you, the Chronicle would be the last,
the last paper.
and was that all day Thursday? You'd be involved in all of that, right?
Actually, the Hampton Bays News was the last
Oh, yeah.
Was
They came out on Fridays.
Okay. But Thursday was a long day for
Oh,
you.
and how?
And then she had to go home and cook for 10 people.
Yeah. And I used to take my little boy with me instead of put him on the stool.
Bill Camp, Chief Collator.
I guess you probably had to try to go to bed early Wednesday night.
I still go to bed early.
All right, Larry, let's talk with you a little bit about what you did. And it might take a little bit of explaining.
Well, let me back up first.
Okay.
Initially, you had said that I have a son, Jonathan. Actually, I had 3 sons. The oldest one we lost 8 years ago, but nevertheless, we had 3 boys. Getting back to what I did, the late 40s, 49, 50, my mother used to work for Irene's mother. And she came home one day and she said that her needed someone to come in on Saturdays to clean up. And my mother volunteered my services. And from that point on, I got to Southampton Press during the summers. And when I graduated, I got a job in Montauk for a while. And meanwhile, I was still working at the press on Saturdays. And when Dave, when the Korean War broke out, Dave volunteered again, and thus created an opening for me, and Herb offered me the job. With the understanding that when Dave came back, that I may or may not have a year-round job. But nevertheless, as it worked out, there was room for both of us. My job, Herb taught me small presses, how to put a newspaper together, how to put jobs together. One of the things that we did was melting metal into what we call a pig. And we had this little room with which we melted metal. The metal had to be heated to about 625 degrees. It was a very small room. And in the summertime, it was extremely hot. And what you had to watch out for, particularly in the wintertime, there was an exhaust fan, and if the snow was on the roof and it got warm, you had water or snow that would drip down into the pot. Now you got this very cold water dropping down on the metal at 625 degrees, which would just basically explode. And sometimes you might, if you're not careful, you get it on your flesh or your hair. That's not the reason I don't have it. Or you get it on your shoes, and it would pick it off, but that was one of the things that, it was just part of the job. And we had to, when we put the newspaper together, we print 4 pages at a time, and those pages weighed, probably 80, 85 pounds. And they were locked in with what we call coins, which are these things, which open up when you put a coin key in it, like so, and it exerted pressure against the form, thus keeping everything in place and not falling out. We could probably print 4 pages at a time, and it was all sheet fed by hand. You could print 1,200 to 1,500 pages an hour. Meanwhile, Herb would be putting the other 4 pages that backed up those pages together, and once you finished that, you would flip that sheet over and print the other 4 pages, thus giving you 8 pages. And after we printed the pages, we had to run it through a folder to fold it down into a broadsheet, and sometimes a quarter fold for mailing, which was Mrs. Stamp's department. And sometimes when you had a lot of static electricity, the sheet would come off the press would zigzag. So we have to have somebody at the end of the press to catch the sheet and jog it together. And sometimes it wasn't a very pleasant thing, because as you grab the sheet, you had the static electricity, you get zapped. But I think Irene or somebody mentioned that about air conditioning.
Right.
We had air conditioning.
What was it?
They got very hot in the summer. And one day Pete went to, I guess it was Herrick Hardware, and he got this garden hose with the hoses in it. Ran it across the top of the building. That was our air conditioning.
Didn't I hear that Leslie helped out once when you guys were really hot? What was that, Larry?
Mrs. Brown, excuse me, asked her granddaughter to go up to college. She's going to get us all ice cream cones. Well, Leslie, this is in the middle of the summer. Here's Leslie coming from college, walking down Joe Lane. All these ice cream cones and ice cream.
And it wasn't that far.
No, it wasn't.
Larry, because some of us know nothing about the kind of press, right? Can you just tell us a little bit about the press itself?
The press itself?
Yeah, it was very big, right?
And, yes, it was a press in which, let's see, it was, where the operator stood was about 3 or 4 feet off the floor, and it had like a pedal in which you kicked to go on impression, and you kicked it, or you push it down to shut the impression off. And it was quite an art to, if you can picture a very large sheet of newsprint, which is very flimsy. You had to pick it, and you snap it, and you bring it down to the grippers on the press, and you just slide it over to the side guys. That's quite an art to do. But we
learned to do that for each sheet that went through.
Each sheet that went through. And you might be printing, I don't know how many presses we printed at that time, probably 2,500 presses. And you have to do that, and you flip the sheet over, and you do it again. And that would only give you 8 pages, and sometimes you had 10, 12, 16 pages.
But not only that, didn't you have to set every letter by hand?
Well, not every line by hand.
But I mean, in the beginning, to set it up, right?
That was before my time.
Oh.
Yes,
Okay.
way back when, they did set a newspaper by what we call hand type, which was individual letters. Somewhere over there, there's a type case.
Oh, just there we go.
And each slot had its individual letter, and you had to pick out types, line for line. And I would imagine those went blind doing that. Even after it was done, you had to put it back in preparation for the next page.
Letter by letter.
Yeah.
Letter by letter.
And then later, the linotype machine came in and produced
and that's what this stuff is.
physical lines of type.
Each line is an individual slug.
The hot type.
Yeah. That's a lot different. And the way we learn to read these slugs You take a newspaper and you turn it upside down, because that's where the slug is. You read the newspaper upside down, then you can read the slug. That's what, the way we learn to read.
Now, once you've gone to all this trouble to set everything up, right? Did you ever have any accidents where things?
Well, you would have to bring that up. A newspaper is, well, say an 8 pages, comprised of what we call this is a galley, about 20 inches of single column type. And we had a table with rollers on the legs to move it about. And one Wednesday night we were putting the paper together. We had about 15, 16 galleys of type on this table. And a young man walked in, and we won't even call him by name, but I will point to him. And he sat on this table.
Just on the corner of it.
And the next thing you know, we got 15 galleys of type laying on the floor.
The leg gave way.
All these individual lines on the floor. Fortunately, we had galley proofs.
There's samples of those over on the table.
Tom, could you pick up
Those
one
are
of those
galley,
and hand
those are
it?
galley proofs. And we had to pick up this type line by line and put it back in order. And in some cases, it was easy just to completely reset the story.
It was a long night.
It was a long night. Mrs. Street, that was one night that Herb called his wife and Bueller bought us all supper. Because we weren't leaving that place. And it was just a long night. But it wasn't as long as the first issue of Dan's paper that Dave and I put out. So Dave and myself and Bill Robinson. Bill deserted us. He left us about 2 o'clock in the morning.
It was then the Montauk Pioneer, right? That was Dan's first paper.
Dan's first paper was the Montauk Pioneer. And when we finished that paper, when we put that paper to bed, Dave and I, Sherry Dairy was delivering milk. So that must have been about 6 in the morning. Went home, slept for 2 hours, because that was a Thursday night. I had to come back Friday to put out the Hampton Bay News. I was never so tired in all my life.
When you say put the paper to bed, does that mean it's all printed, everything's done?
All printed,
Out of your
put it to
hands?
bed, and it's up to the mailing department.
Left in
Okay.
piles for Mrs. Camp to
Yes.
come and attack the next morning at 2 o'clock.
That's right.
Did they ever miss an issue, Irene?
I don't think,
No.
as long as my dad was there, never mentioned. And even there was that bad fire.
Fire, they never
In
missed an issue.
1940, there was a terrible fire. But the fire was put out. The building was pretty much destroyed.
I think so.
Temporary office was set up on Herrick Road in the Berlin House. I don't know how they put that issue out, but they did.
Someone
Must have
else
been
printed it, I'm
short.
sure, for a few weeks, but
Yeah.
not longer.
1940, huh?
I wasn't even.
What about power failures? I mean, did they have a generator in case of?
No.
It just didn't stop you from doing it.
No.
You guys were like the
Let's just
post
stay there
office.
till we finished.
Stay there. What was the weekly schedule of the press, of life there? In other words, what happened when? So, okay, a story happens, right? Well, first of all, how do you find out about the story? I mean, there were no cell phones. Did someone call Portia or your mom? Or how
Well,
did
the days I remember when Pete Moore was the editor, Southampton was so small, everyone knew what was going on. And Pete would just go around to different meetings and write them up. He was kind of a one-man operation in terms of the editorial process. And then on Mondays and Tuesdays, all the stories would get written and set in type. Then they'd be proofread in these galley proofs, which you'll see when you come up later. And edited for errors and so forth, proofread. And then by what, Larry, roughly Wednesday morning, we'd start putting preliminarily the pages together, or Wednesday afternoon?
Tuesday, Wednesday was generally, we had what we call a dead sheet. And a dead sheet is simply the ads that have been either killed or changed. We have an exit through it if it was killed.
From the previous week's issue.
CH if it was changed, and we would take those ads out, and we recreate new ads, and the way we figured out as to how many pages we're going to be, we add up all of what we call the dead ads, and against what we call the new ads. And that way we can determine whether it's going to be 8 pages, 10 pages, 12 pages, etc. Then we would place the ads in the paper, and then the editor generally would come out with a mock-up sheet for the front page, in which case Herb and the editor generally work together and putting the front page together. And from that point on, the rest of us, Dave, myself, would put the other pages together until we got 4 pages together to go on press. And I can still remember the format of all the pages. But,
And when would that first section be printed roughly?
Probably about Wednesday. We might go on press about 5, 6 o'clock. And we stay there till 12, 1.
So if news happened late, breaking news, it would be later on in the paper then, is that the case?
Generally speaking, it wouldn't make the front page because the front page is already done.
Okay. Who wrote the headlines?
Pete.
Did Pete Moore write the
Pete
headlines?
and Portia.
Yeah.
How about your parents, Peter? How much did they have to say about what was in the paper?
Well, very little, I assume. I wasn't really that involved in the editorial process back then, but Pete and Portia pretty much were the...
Well, I think Pete and Mrs. Brown, they would work together as to what took priority.
Right.
Then at some point, I think she just gave Pete a free hand to do whatever he saw best.
Right.
She was probably more involved in that editorial decision-making than my parents were.
Yes,
later.
she was.
Yeah.
She was.
Okay. Now, can you just explain to us a little bit about job printing and what that is? Because that was a lot of the work that you did, was it not, Larry,
Yeah.
Irene? Irene, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, job printing, well, simply stationery, letterhead, business cards, brochures,
There's some samples up here.
things of that nature. And those are enough to keep us really going all the time.
So after the press was finished?
Yeah, beginning of the week, nights, my dad came back and worked nights a lot of time to do estimates and do jobs, Saturday morning. So the jobs had to be fit in all through that week. And that was hard in the summer because there were big social events going on in the summer,
Yeah.
which we all loved, really. One was the fiesta,
Oh,
and with all the things that had to be printed for the fiesta, and of course the people who organized it coming into the press and meeting with my father. So we saw a lot of interesting people. And then there was the Southampton Horse Show, which was the forerunner of the Hampton Classic. And we had Mrs. Lloyd Dewey and Mrs. Wadley coming in every morning to talk to my dad, who was trying to run off, do job work. And then finally the powwow was a big one at the end of the summer. And then, you know, we had to print the big program, and it was involved between getting all the names spelled right. And
Yeah.
so the job work was hard to get done in the summer. And then after Labor Day, went back to the kind of a normal routine.
Well, that's when we.
But Larry was really in charge of the job printing later on.
Well, that's when we, likewise, the staff got bigger because we had a line of youths come in from Noyak, and after we just got bigger. As a matter of fact, the building itself was, I believe, was added on to the back, all the way back to the fence.
Right.
Because
When the new press came in
Yes.
in the 60s.
the new press, Carl.
Carl Loomis came with the press from the News Review.
Yes.
about the
And it
press?
was fed by a roll of newsprint as opposed to sheet
Right,
fed
that
that
was
Larry
what-
referred to before.
It was a web
Much
press.
more automated. There's a
Yes.
picture Larry found on the internet of a very similar model.
It looked very similar to this one, and it was called a web press. And there was simply a roll of newsprint that was fed through the press. And sometimes if the tension wasn't correct, the web would break and make one heck of a noise.
As you can picture, the roll is always moving, but when the impression's being made, the paper has to sit still on the type.
Yeah.
So there's a whole mechanism for keeping the web moving at both ends, but in the middle, the paper standing still. And really require a lot of attention and fine tuning. And when the web broke, it was a mess before.
How often did it happen that you had to redo pages or redo a lot of what you had done? Did it happen? Not really.
Not really. The things that you really had to be careful of in putting your phones on the press, that you didn't drop anything on the type. We had the makeup rule, which is a steel rule. And if you happen to drop it on the type and you run the press, what you do is you smash the type.
Oh,
And you smash the packing. You can reset that type and change the packing. Little accidents like that.
During the week, because you sort of had this weekly schedule, was it very stressful? I mean, did you feel the stress? I mean, sometimes I think that nowadays I don't like to call the Southampton Press too much and talk to an editor if it's Tuesday, but was it that way back then? Did you feel the stress of the deadlines?
I think on Wednesday, probably I felt the stress most.
It wasn't bad because we had fun.
We
You
did.
had fun.
Dave and I had fun anyway.
Yeah, you did.
Now, you've told us a little bit about where you sold the paper. Did you sell it in all the luncheonettes, all the dime stores, stationery stores?
Pharmacies.
Oh, yeah.
And the AFP.
In the AV? How much did it cost? Do you remember back then?
5 or 10 cents, I remember.
But Hillary and I went over to the press, and one of the things that Hillary pointed out was that they seemed to have a lot of car advertisements, didn't they? Back then.
Back then they did, sure.
Mm-hmm.
They were national ads. Ford, Chevrolet,
Mm-hmm.
at the time, Bob Roberts had Rambler, and Johnny Rose had Ford, and there was a soda dealership down on Windmill Lane. Van Score and Downs, I believe, was the Cadillac agency up on Hill Street. There were a lot of national ads. And also the phone company, telephone, used to put in big ads.
Mm-hmm.
And gas was what? About 25 cents a gallon?
Yeah.
Oh, 17, 18 cents, something like that.
Yeah.
Did certain businesses have preferred places where their ads were? In other words, if somebody was a frequent advertiser, did they get a good spot?
If you requested a particular position, you more than likely got it. But for the most part, we tried not to, obviously we didn't put Ford next to Chevrolet.
Right. Okay. Now, how many
Ferrari
sections were in the
next to
was the paper? One section?
Originally just one section. There's some samples of that here, Larry, right?
Well, it depended. It depended likewise on how many ads there were. There could have been an 8-page section, which would have been just, or 10 or 12. I've seen as many as 16 ones.
Even with the sheet-fed press?
With the sheet-fed press. And then as we got into the wet press, I think at that time we had 2 ad salesmen, Bob McLaughlin and Jack Brayers. And that's when the paper got a little bit bigger. So
Was that ever more than 2 sections in the summer, for instance?
with the web?
Yeah.
Probably not. That would have made 32 pages.
Because with the Hamptonian, which was printed in West Hampton, that would have been the summer 3rd section.
What would you say the 50s were like in terms of issues in the village? Mary Cummings wrote a wonderful section in your 100th anniversary issue commenting on sort of what kind of a decade that was. What would you say about that?
Well, I would say offhand there weren't too many issues. I mean, life after World War II and until maybe the Beatles and the Rolling Stones came along, it was a pretty simple, straightforward, repetitive weekly schedule, especially with the paper having a regular scheduled publication. And zoning only came in the mid-1950s, so I mean, even the kinds of land use issues that we think of as being hot items today really didn't. Everything was on cruise control, which didn't exist. But
And what about crime? Not much to report?
Well, they have a police blotter. As a matter of fact, they had, what did we have? Mind you, I never was there,
Right.
but there was a 1-cell or 2-cell jail upstairs over the...
Oh, yeah. At the Village Hall, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
So I guess it wasn't.
Wasn't,
This
they didn't
wasn't
need a big
that
place. What about letters to the editor? Do many people write, or, I mean, obviously, probably there weren't a lot of hot issues.
Not
so
like
they
today.
Not like today.
No.
Was the press ever, as far as you know, were they ever worried about being sued for libel? Or was that
Not that I was
also a
aware of.
non-issue? Now, when Hillary and I and Hillary stayed to browse through some papers and from the 50s, but one of the pieces from January of 1957, Mr. and Mrs. John Holton entertained friends at their home on New Year's Eve. There was a card driven into the style shop. Do you remember this? There were ads for telephone answering services, which, you know, a lot of people had, I guess. She noted that there was a 5-bedroom cape in the village listed for $18,500. Apartments, a nice apartment renting for $75 a month. But we need to hear, there wasn't there a front page photo of you once in the paper, Peter, or shouldn't we?
Well, yeah, I was the poster child for not riding your bicycle on Main Street in Southampton. It was a posed picture, and Chief Donald Finley was yelling at me for riding my bicycle on Main Street, on the sidewalk actually, but it was posed.
Now, one of the most famous stories that we learned about the press, and I have to say it happened in 1970 something early, but we got to hear about it, and it was Portia Flanagan's April Fool's issue. Can one of you tell us about that?
Well, you know more about that, Irene. Irene brought in a copy of the front page.
Okay, just tell us the little background. Portia, who was the editor, right, decided to... Do you want to get a hold of that copy?
Well, it was April, the press happened to come out, always came out on Thursday, which happened to be April 1st. And I don't know who decided it, whether it's Portia and my dad or whatever, all collectively came up with this idea to say that Lake Agawam was going to be filled with a high-rise apartment development. And anyway, you'll see the headlines here someplace.
And with a photograph.
With a photograph. And you know, most of the people who read it believed it. Apparently, it really caused a ruckus.
Looks like
Dan's favorites.
Dan's favorites.
That's where he got the idea from you guys, I guess.
The headline's great, but we should have it here. It says,
It is.
Where is it? Can you see?
huge complex to arise from Lake Agawam. I mean, it was really well worded.
And I
We'll
think
find
that
it.
someone mentioned that there may have been a demonstration in protest, right?
Yeah, there was a joke that the police put a sign in the window closed or whatever, you know, because of their false advertising. And students at the college got wind of this and came down and started protesting freedom of the press. They didn't realize the whole thing was a big joke. And
Apartment complex will rise from Agawam Lake's bottom. And here's the developer explaining it. The developer, John Luflurpa, which is April Fool spelled backwards. Here's the sign. Closed by village police for inciting riot.
That's a great
Everyone
story.
had fun back
They
in
probably
those
wouldn't
days.
do that today, would they? What about, did some things end up in the press that were kind of humorous or funny, mistakes that were made, words that were misspelled? Did that ever happen?
But I don't recall.
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, I think there was a picture of Irene, right? Tell me.
Yeah. The Hamptonian, of course, everyone loved to read the Hamptonian. It got to have such a great reputation as being the best part of the press, the Hamptonian.
The summer supplement.
Because these photographers would go around to Herb McCarthy's or would go to some of these social events and take pictures of all the important people there. And when I was in high school, I went, at Herb McCarthy's, they had Lester Lannon nights, where you could get all dressed up and go dance the night away, and my date was Billy Cordy. And, so funny. I had on a real pretty dress, and Billy had on tuxedo shorts with long socks, and a nice jacket and everything, and we had a great time. On the way out, we had our picture taken, and the next morning it was Mr. and Mrs. William Cordy enjoying night out. I was only in high school.
And no one caught it. That's
Yeah.
Were there any sensational stories that happened, murders or anything like that?
not in the 50s in Southampton.
What about, were there any local stories that national newspapers ever picked up? There was a big party once that was in the paper. We don't have to name names. Right, Peter?
Irene remembers this one pretty well.
I don't.
Oh, some things are best left undiscussed.
Okay. All right, we won't get into that then. Well, let's see. I think Merritt White was the Rotary Boy of the Month in one of the issues that we came across. How were relations between all of those of you who worked at the Southampton Press? How would you describe them?
It was a family-run business, and we had a great time together. We really did.
That's my main recollection of it. Going to the press was fun. And Larry and all the other guys were almost like older brothers or uncles to me.
That's right.
And
I think I can tell this.
we all had a great time together, really a great time.
When we had this press, pit in the area, because it was two flatbed, one high level, on the floor level, and then we had a pit. And we had this pressman, won't call him name, who had a tendency to, let's see, indulge. And one day Herb said to him, I want you to get those bottles out of the pit. And he said, what bottles? He also had them downstairs, because in the old press office, the old press, there used to be a bakery downstairs, and the oven was still there. And he also had them lined up in the oven too.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I think we'll have time for a few questions, but I'm really grateful to all of you, and I'm sure we all are, for coming and talking about these early days and getting a sense from you of what a wonderful work experience it was. And thank you very, very much for being here.